The year is 1422. In a yard outside the Inns of Court in central London, rival factions split along lines of allegiance as their leaders, the 3rd Duke of York, Richard Plantagenet, and the Lancastrian Edmund Beaufort, the 2nd Duke of Somerset, quarrel. York supporters gather around, plucking white roses from the bushes to signify their fealty to their liege. Somerset supporters pluck red roses. As the two sides square off, they are unaware that they are already wading into the bloody battle that will soon take over the whole of the nation, leaving its imprint on the English landscape and transforming the monarchy and the notion of divine right of kings forever. The Wars of the Roses have begun. Except that never happened. It's a scene made famous by Shakespeare in Henry VI, Part 1, Act 2, Scene 4 to be specific. But like so many of the scenes that populate Shakespeare's histories, it is an embellishment, written generations after the fact, clouded by Tudor propaganda and the need to paint the sitting monarch, Queen Elizabeth's ancestors, in the best possible light. Such is the power of Shakespeare's words, however, that fact has become so clouded by fiction, it's often quite difficult for even the most studious and unbiased historian to tease the two apart. What were the Wars of the Roses? At the core, it was a long dynastic battle between warring factions who each had a strong claim to the throne of England. And we say wars, plural, because it was actually a series of skirmishes and not one big battle, lasting roughly 30 years from 1455 to 1485. But its roots can be traced back to the death of Edward III in 1377, when the crown skipped a generation and left Edward's living sons in a lurch while his grandson assumed the throne. That span of more than 200 years of history, from 1377 and the Seeds of Unrest through to the 1590s when Shakespeare wrote his famous minor tetralogy, is more than enough time for legends to appear, and the more than 400 years since Shakespeare wrote it has been more than enough time for legends to become accepted fact. But who was Henry Bolingbroke, or Henry Hotspur? Are we right to view Henry V as the impetuous prince turned prodigal son, the great warrior king and battlefield orator as portrayed by Shakespeare? Was Henry VI truly as inept a ruler as he is popularly imagined? And was Richard III truly a hunchbacked murderer who killed his nephews in the Tower of London in 1483? Who, in all this mess, was the true and rightful heir to the English throne?
Since brevity is the soul of wit,
more of your conversation would infect my brain.
Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?
To speak of him as my kinsman, he's a most notable coward, an infinite and endless liar, an hourly promise breaker, the owner of no one good quality worthy your lordship's entertainment.
I'd beat thee, but I should infect my hand.
The lady doth protest too much, methinks.
The course of true love never did run smooth.
Dun, 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 dun,
Oh, fuck
dun,
off.
dun, dun.
This is what I have to do in class when my kids make me laugh and I have to teach. I'm like, fuck no. So what's the deal with the Wars of the Roses? That's the question we'll be looking at today as we attempt to piece together some semblance of truth from the fragments of fiction. Right, Aiden?
That's right, Lindsay. That is our goal. And that was a very well done introduction, Lindsay. I think
Thank
you laid it all out there. I
you.
think we can just pack up the bags and go. Except there's a few niggling points that I think we'll have to discuss in further detail. But I want to just give the listener a little reassurance. History, maybe it's not your thing. Maybe, warring houses and all this stuff doesn't really do it for you. Unless, of course, you're one of the tens of millions of fans of the HBO series Game of Thrones and the associated book, of which Lindsay obviously
you were going to bring this
is
up.
a giant fan. Lindsay loves Game of Thrones. She loves Song of Ice and Fire. She just can't get enough of them. I am being very sarcastic because Lindsay's
shaking
eyes
my head
are
at you right now.
Yeah, she's shooting ice daggers.
It's
at
not
me.
that I don't like Game of Thrones. It's just I've never watched it because violence does not sit well with me. And the violence in Game of Thrones, the visually depicted violence, I just can't do it.
Okay, well that's fine because you've already read all about it. Because for those of you who may be fans of the show but not fans of history, Game of Thrones is based on the War of the Roses. The Lannisters and the Starks came from Lancastrians and Yorks. It wasn't really a big stretch. George R. R. Martin has famously referenced this multiple times, and
has he actually come out and said like he actually based it on?
Yeah, it was based on the Wars.
Really?
Yeah, a couple
the
times
Wars of the
he said
Roses.
that, yeah. I mean, amongst other things, and the politics of Westeros don't quite match up with the kingship
and there
of
were
England.
no dragons or
maybe
some incest.
Yeah, there were some hints of incest at least, and definitely some backstabbing in the English, in the real history. So some of the drama is the same, but there's it's less fantastic.
So, Aiden, are you telling us that at various points throughout this podcast, you are going to be making references to Game of Thrones?
Yes, where necessary, I will draw the parallels to the Game of Thrones characters, so that listeners who just listeners, unlike Lindsay, who are actually interested in good media. That makes it sound like I just slag Shakespeare, because that's the thing we're talking about. But no, anybody who likes Game of Thrones, I will try and draw the obvious parallels, and perhaps some not so obvious ones. I would also like to point out that this episode is brought to you today by Paradox Interactive, the makers of Europa Universalis 4 and Crusader Kings 2.
This is not... We're not sponsored by them or anything. It's just that Aiden has spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours neglecting me and our cats to play these games on
in fact, we were going to record this yesterday, and then I was actually having my little own War of the Roses on a game.
And he got so mad when he lost Scotland that ruined his whole night.
I vassalized them so good. Anyways, those are two video games for nerds who perhaps don't like Game of Thrones but enjoy history. We're putting up links to those games as well. They basically let you live out your medieval and Renaissance era historical fantasies, conquering lands and marrying your sister. It's all very disturbing, but just wanted to point out that one half of this podcast loves those games as well.
For me, the only prep I did for this was I read a book. So
that's good though, Lindsay. What was the book you read?
It was called The Wars of the Roses, England's First Civil War by Trevor Royal. 400 and some page epic, going all the way back to the death of Edward III, leading all the way through to, well, really the end of the book ends with the end of the Plantagenet line.
And the rise of the Tudors?
No, beyond that, because the last direct descendant died in like 1713 or something. So it actually covers quite a substantial 350-year history.
Yeah, that's a big chunk of history.
Yeah.
I also read a book. It was also called The Wars of the Roses, but it's also called, in other versions, I think in the UK, it's actually called The Hollow Crown. And it's by Dan Jones, who also does a bunch of great documentaries.
Oh, yeah, we will
online.
link to them because they are fantastic.
Yeah, and actually the documentary matches very closely to the book, so if you just want to have 3 or 4 hours to just go through the documentary, you'll get a good summary.
That sounds like such a good afternoon, 3 to 4 hours.
That's what we did one afternoon. We watched
I'll do it
this.
again. That's awesome.
Anyways, it was also a very good read. It started a little bit later than yours. It started with about Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt, and followed through basically to Henry VIII and kind of the wrapping up of the Tudor lineage there. So with that in mind, we wanted to start off with some of the background, the contextual history to it, and that really does cover more of what Lindsay read about, so I'll let her probably discuss most of this. But yeah, the Wars of the Roses didn't just pop up out of nowhere.
No, they didn't, and I think that's a common misconception that a lot of people have. They think about it as being this 30-year gap in the direct line of succession, I guess, where there was warring between these two houses of the same royal line, right? And there was the seeds of that were really born with the death of Edward III in 1377. So I'm going to try and make this long story short, but it's kind of hard to do it justice, especially on a podcast. If you're curious, I will throw up an image, a royal lineage chart, so that you can kind of follow along if you want on our webpage. So 1377, Edward III dies. He's one of the most successful medieval kings. He's a great warrior. He's successful in the early battles of the 100 Years' War, which England was fighting with France. And he restored royal authority following the end to his father, Edward II's reign. That was the famous deposition of Edward II by his wife, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. Edward II maybe possibly being a little bit bisexual possibly, or full-on gay, not something that was acceptable at the time. So there were a lot of rumors about the way that he was dispatched, and one of them was that he had a red-hot poker shoved up his bum, which may or may not have been true, but either way...
Not in Game of Thrones.
In Game of Thrones, it absolutely would have happened, but whether or not that actually happened is not something that is confirmed. But this was kind of a disastrous end to his reign. Edward III was installed on the throne in his place, but he wasn't actually able to reign until I think he was about 17 years old. And then he does like 50 years on the throne and has a really great run of things. But he dies, and his eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, has already predeceased him, as well as his second son. So he's got 3 surviving adult sons left. Because of the rules of who can succeed on the throne, it has to be a firstborn son. And his firstborn son is dead. Lucky for him, his firstborn son had a firstborn son. So the throne gets passed to Edward III's grandson, Richard II, bypassing the 3 surviving adult sons who are...
Yeah.
In any other case would probably be more closely in line for the throne.
Well, they'd be more prepared to take the throne.
Well,
for
absolutely.
Sure, because Richard II was 10 years old.
Yes,
at this
exactly.
Point. Yeah, so they'd definitely be in a better position to be king at least.
Absolutely. But because of the rules of primogeniture, this was a male-only primogeniture situation where only the firstborn male could inherit the throne. Mm-hmm. So this leaves... most famously his third son, John of Gaunt, in a lurch, kind of, as the kind of counsel to the king. He rules kind of in his stead until he reaches the age of majority. So he's acting as counsel or regent, and it's their descendants, most notably, the Duke of Lancaster, John, and Edmund, Duke of York, who kind of are the heads of the families that later start the Wars of the Roses. And it all kind of starts with this issue of who should actually have ascended to the throne upon Edward III's death. Richard II does a fine job, I guess, at the start of his reign. He puts down the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. This was an uprising popularly led by Wat Tyler, who is a famous figure in English history, but the peasants revolted because they wanted more power, and Richard kind of gives it to them, but not really, and he puts down this revolt fairly spectacularly. He's only like 17 or 18 years old when it happens, right? And things are going pretty smoothly, I guess, for the first little bit, but eventually he kind of butts up against Parliament and against his own nobles and lords around him. He ends up not being able to get enough money from Parliament to sustain his coffers and his expenses, I guess. And he surrounded himself with people that his lords, notably his own uncle, one of Edward III's sons, don't agree with these people. So they kind of approach him and say, let's take this back a step, and he agrees initially, but eventually he comes back and seeks retribution against this group called the Lords Appellant, who he famously either exiles or executes them in the end. But this is sometime later on in his reign. And then, so under the Merciless Parliament, which was 1388, is when he kind of accepts the Lords Appellant demands, mm-hmm. and then reigns sort of through that until 1390s, when he kind of begins this tyrannical reign that lasts until 1399, which is when he is deposed in favor of Henry IV. And it's interesting how Henry IV comes into play, because as shown in Shakespeare's play Richard II, he is exiled after was it a jousting match or something?
Yeah, or a duel or some sort.
The Duke
he
of
wanted
Norfolk.
to fight somebody, yeah.
Yeah, and rather than allow them to go through this, Richard just exiles them both. And this is kind of what kicks off the events that lead to Henry Bolingbroke, or the future Henry IV, coming back and taking the throne. So we have a king being deposed again, which is not something that happens very often in English history. I think it had happened a few times before this, notably with, 1066, Harold Godwinson being deposed in favor of William the Conqueror.
Well, yeah.
deposed,
Yeah,
killed.
It's a fancy way of putting it. Yeah.
You had King John being deposed for not agreeing to uphold the Magna Carta that he'd signed. There was Edward II, Edward III's father, Edward II, who was deposed, quote unquote. So it's
poked.
yeah. So it's not like it's something that happens. But in each of those cases, it was either somebody coming in and conquering the land and taking the throne, or it was somebody being pushed out in favor of a male descendant.
Yeah. And someone close in line, and it was
like a son or a
exactly-
brother,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
In this case, it's a cousin who comes in, who has a strong claim, but it's a claim through the third surviving son of Edward III, not the firstborn son. So this is where you have the kind of the seeds of doubt that start to creep into the whole thing. So Henry IV comes in. He reigns for a little while, kind of an unsteady reign. It's not, he's fine, but I mean, if you've deposed a king, you're always going to be looking over your shoulder. His son, Henry V, has a much stronger hold on the English monarchy and the throne itself because of the fact that he's the son of a deposed, or of a king who deposed another king.
Yeah.
So he's a little bit more secure, but he also has great success on the battlefield. And so, I mean, famously, right? The Battle of Agincourt. So that's going well for him. And then he has a son who reigns from the age of, 9 months? Yeah. Henry VI ascends to the throne.
Yeah, and that's where it really starts getting messy.
Things fall apart when Henry VI comes to the throne.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Henry V, great king. Everybody loved him. Even somehow, some of the people he conquered in France, famously, marrying the daughter of the king of France, and thereby potentially making his son, Henry VI, king of both England and France.
Was he not the only king to hold that title officially?
I think so.
Did Henry
yes.
V ever hold it?
No, because he was going to let, I don't remember, it was one of the Charleses, I think,
Right.
was the king of France, and he was an older man, and he knew, so he knew he would eventually, when he died, the title would pass on to either Henry V or Henry, his heirs, right?
So Henry VI.
So Henry VI. But the problem with Henry VI is that he was a very terrible king. He was the opposite of his father in almost every way. Foremost, I think, obviously, is the warrior component. Whereas Henry V took a much smaller army and basically conquered France, Henry VI had a position of extreme power over France and had the much stronger army and still managed to lose it all back.
Well, except for Calais.
Yeah, he kept one tiny sliver. That's great. But that is a problem, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But the much bigger problem was just that Henry VI, by all accounts, was not a very bright man. They described him as simple-minded, easily swayed, completely uninterested in matters of state, and he was even prone to bouts of mental instability, let's call them.
Yeah.
So he would have bouts where he'd just go catatonic. Yeah, just completely freeze. At one point it's for 18 months, which is in the story. We'll get there too. But this problem of Henry VI not being an active king is really the entire impetus for the Wars of the Roses. To draw my first Game of Thrones parallel here for you, Lindsay, it's kind of how Robert Baratheon was a terrible king. And when he died, it's a little different because Robert Baratheon had no real legitimate children because Cersei was having incest and all that. Anyways, the point is, when there's a power vacuum at the top of monarchy, bad things happen. And that's what happens here with Henry VI, is he's a living empty
power
king,
vacuum.
basically. Yeah, exactly.
I guess the thing about having an empty vacuum of at the throne is, I mean, there were rumors that Henry, because he was so devout and he was so religious, he didn't even like the idea of nakedness or nudity.
Yeah.
So how could he have conceived his own son? There were rumors that his own son, Edward.
I think it was another Edward. Yeah.
Yeah, was not legitimate because how could he possibly have, but that. Setting that aside, I mean, he was the son of a Valois. The Valois were a famous family in France.
Yeah.
And they suffered from a kind of a genetic mental instability that plagued Charles VI. His mother didn't have it, but it's possible that he had it because the catatonia that he lapsed into has been looked at by modern scientists and psychologists and people kind of suspect that he may have been schizophrenic or that he had some kind of mental illness. So it's not like he was a bad king by choice. They were just, it's one of those genetic lottery type situations that you're king and you don't, that's part of the genetic lottery, but also you're suffering from some kind of maladaptation or malformity or something that is just isn't going in your favor. So I kind of feel bad for Henry VI to get saddled with this, but he wasn't a great king.
No,
so.
and that's one of the hard things reading the histories about him is that he seems like just a nice, simple guy. Like he would basically do whatever the last advisor would tell him to do.
Which I think is hilarious. It's like Donald Trump. Are we going to, in 50 years or 150 years, say, Donald Trump seemed like a nice guy. He just went with the last thing that anybody ever told him.
Of course, he only listened to, one half of the country, but that's another thing. But yeah, like Henry VI, he was, as you mentioned, very pious. Just a stand-up guy, apparently. He would give you the clothes off his back because he really didn't care much even for being a king. There's a period where he gets deposed that we'll get into, and it seems like he was just as happy not being king
chilling.
as being king. Like as long as they treated him fairly decently, he was an okay guy, right?
Wasn't that the point where when he was reinstated as king, he had to have new clothes made for him because he was wearing just terrible clothing, not befitting a king?
Yeah,
so he was just like, guys, let's chill.
Yeah,
it was probably more serious than that, but.
But it's
anyway.
true. And I mean, you brought this up when we were talking, Lindsay, that this is a problem across Europe at this point in time because there's so much inbreeding.
I mean, look at the
on.
Habsburgs.
Yeah, the Habsburgs are
and those noses and the chins.
The chin. I mean, we're only a couple of centuries away from Charles V, and that chin is enough to conquer Europe on its own, which it almost did. So, I mean, there is just a constant thing, and this is one of the problems with
it's inbreeding. Even though you had to get a dispensation from the Pope in order to marry someone who you were blood related to avoid consanguinity. It still happened, and of course even people did get married without that papal dispensation. So I mean, if you look back through the royal houses across Europe, they are all related to one another. It's hard to avoid it even today. You got to go outside your own gene pool to find. Thank goodness William and Harry went way outside. Like, thank goodness.
Better for everybody. I think we're all in agreement. But jumping back to Henry the Sixth. So this problem doesn't rear itself immediately, though, because, I mean, he's 9 months old, as you mentioned, Lindsay, when he becomes king of both England and France somehow. So while he's a child, there's a lot of goodwill behind him, and there was a lot of goodwill behind Henry V's reign. So everyone's still willing to pitch in and cover for this child. There's some really great stories, though, of like they had to give him an anointed object, like as an infant.
Yeah,
he had to touch it. In order to have it be considered blessed. And like then it could become an official seal or something like that, right? Like there's all these kind of crazy stories of him acting as a king
when
well
he's
bkind
not able to read.
Yeah, or
talk,
say,
or walk.
Exactly. So it's kind of great, but all the nobles, all the country leaders kind of rally around us. And how it winds up working for a large portion of his early life is that there's a man from the Duke of Somerset. I don't know his actual name right now, but he basically acts as the de facto ruler. He fills in and does all the work of the king in the medieval era, which is
prime minister.
Yeah, well, he's essentially prime minister. Yeah, he's settling disputes and levying taxes where necessary. He's helping lead the war.
Because the king is in diapers.
Yeah, exactly. And even for the first couple of years after that. So the Duke of Somerset is kind of running the show. And so as Henry's a child, this isn't much of a problem because everything's going well.
Let me guess. The Duke of Somerset dies.
Yeah, he does die. You know why?
Why?
Because things start going poorly in France. The French, for some reason, don't want, a 6-year-old...
The English?
Yeah, a 6-year-old Englishman is their king. Who would have guessed why? And he gets killed by a rival clique in the court faction who's upset that he's losing the war in France. And with him gone, the country just basically falls to shit. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of factions here. We're going to keep it really kind of simple, and we're going to kind of fall into Shakespeare's tropes of saying, well, there was the Lancastrians and the Yorks. But for the most part, that does actually kind of work. And there's a lot of different leaders at different times. But for the major players for general history, Henry VI was married early on in his life to Margaret of Anjou. So she's, I think, the daughter of a duke in France, or a count, so. The county of Anjou. I don't know. Anyways, she's a fairly big, important noble from France. And she's kind of also helping run the show, especially after Somerset's gone. She's kind of helping organize everything in England. And then on the Yorkist side, there is Richard, the Duke of York. And these are the kind of two teams that are going to be facing off against each other for the duration of basically the rest of the war.
So York eventually, he initially sets himself up to kind of be the new Duke of Somerset, kind of the new prime minister, with all of those levers of power at his disposal. Mm-hmm. And he does that fairly well for at least 18 months or so when Henry is in his first catatonic state.
Yeah. So sorry, I forgot to mention that. But the thing that part of what causes, like, they start losing the war, and then they basically lose almost everything.
Yeah,
except
and
for
that's
Calais.
probably what triggered Henry VI's downfall. Is
Yeah.
when he hears that he's lost it. He goes into a fit, and then there's 18 months where he is just bedridden, basically,
and
like literally bedridden, unable to clothe and feed himself. Like it's really bad.
And so and the nobles won't stand for Margaret doing everything while the king's in this bedridden state. So that's when the Duke of York kind of steps in to start that process.
But when Henry kind of comes to, Margaret has the Duke of York shipped out, and her own people kind of surround them and brought back into power. So we have this kind of court intrigue with rival factions starting to split off between the Duke of Somerset and the Lancastrian noblemen.
And it's worth mentioning that York does a pretty good job. While he's this prime minister.
Yeah, he balances the
budget.
Balances the budget. That's not really a thing that happens.
They're not really in debt as much.
but he's not spending as much, and things are going fairly well for him.
And he's doing what Somerset was doing. He's filling in the gap of a terrible king. And so a lot of people look at this and they might think, oh, I'm fine with a Duke of York as king. That kind of makes sense to me. And it starts planting those seeds. Mm-hmm. So when Henry VI wakes up again and the power vacuum is back at the top, but it's easily manipulated by his wife, and York is Gonzo.
In Ireland, I think.
Yeah, he sets off for Ireland, and he wants to, he lays low there for a bit. But then he decides, you know what? Well, and during that time, Henry VI is still terrible. And there are still problems mounting, and there's no way they're going to come back in France. York says, you know what?
I can do a better job of this.
I can do a better job.
So he comes in with aspirations to sit on the throne. And it's interesting that the Duke of York, and later the Earl of Warwick, Warwick the Kingmaker, they very carefully avoided treason. They always pledged allegiance to the king up until the point,
very end, almost. Yeah.
They always said, we're doing this because the king is surrounded by people who are not, kind of like what they did with Richard II, the Lords Appellant did with Richard II. They said, it's the people around you. We are loyal to you, but the people are giving you bad advice, so let us put better people around you. Yeah. And sometimes the kings would go for that, and sometimes they wouldn't. So
and Henry VI really wouldn't, as long as his wife was around.
Because Margaret of Anjou was a badass. I mean, if you want to talk about strong women, which we talked about in our last special episode a couple episodes ago, Margaret of Anjou was one of these very powerful women, like a Cersei Lannister. I think if you want to go with the Game of Thrones references,
that's exactly where I'm going.
That's Margaret of Anjou.
Yeah.
So York is successful in his invasion. He comes back from Ireland and he invades. Everything's going great. He decides at some point that he wants to be king. He doesn't just want to settle for prime minister.
Yeah, and he's testing the waters with the nobles, and he thinks he's going to go for it.
And then he dies.
And then he dies. Yeah.
And it's Richard? It's the Duke of York whose head is placed on the spike with the paper crown on.
Yes, that was him.
Yeah.
Or was that Warwick?
No,
I don't remember.
I think it was the Duke of York.
Anyways,
because that's kind of an insult, right? Adding insult to serious, grievous bodily injury. You've had these aspirations to be a king, and this is how it ends for you.
Which, of course, is not how it happened for Ned Stark. Of course, he was not trying to be king, but he was branded a traitor nonetheless, and his head was also put on a spike just to continue the running Game of Thrones here. So at this point, obviously, everything swings back to the Lancastrians again, and Margaret's there pulling the strings. But in this case, that is not well enough alone. And other Yorkists now have the idea, maybe I could be king as well.
Yeah,
Read
York's...
Rob Stark.
The Duke of York's son, Edward, steps up and decides that he could do a better job than anybody. But he goes straight for the D word, deposition, and heads straight for this end goal. He successfully deposes Henry VI in 1461 and takes over the crown as Edward IV.
Yes.
It's not all happy white roses for this particular son of York. One of his biggest problems is one of his oldest allies, the Earl of Warwick. And we should pause here to talk about Warwick, because Warwick the Kingmaker is a very important character, and we briefly mentioned him up a couple minutes ago, but he was originally aligned with Henry VI, but after a territorial dispute with Somerset, he collaborated with the Duke of York, so Edward's father, and switched sides, so from the Lancasters to the Yorks. And he worked really hard at making Edward IV the king, and this is where he gets the title Kingmaker. So he sees him crowned, and he's made Captain of Calais, I believe,
which is a very important
huge
post, because it's the one part of England that's not in England. So anytime you have any problems, you can just go back to your post where all the men are loyal to you, and you can hide there if need be. That's a little bit of a spoiler alert there.
Exactly. So Warwick is very politically astute, and as the Captain of Calais, I think his plan was to have Edward IV, who at this point, when he was crowned, he was unmarried. So marry him. 22
or something.
Very young, very handsome. He was one of these dashing men he used to wear beautiful outfits and have people look at him all the time. He was very attractive, very attractive vain, king. A very vain man, yes. So why not marry him to some French duchess or some
Burgundian?
French,
there's
Burgundian or someone important that you could form an alliance that could maybe help your foothold on the continent. So Warwick goes through all this trouble and is severely embarrassed when it comes out in 1464 that Edward has already married. And not only has he married without the advice of his council or any other nobles, he's married basically a commoner and an English commoner. Elizabeth Woodville is the woman that he marries, and this is not a politically advantageous marriage at all. The Woodvilles, so Elizabeth's family, are notorious for their social climbing, and Elizabeth herself, as queen, begins to manipulate the levers of power for her own gain and for the gain of her family. She marries off her siblings and cousins to various noblemen and puts them in important positions. So that has to have rankled Warwick quite a lot, because he's spent all this time arranging, and in fact had successfully arranged a marriage that now had to be broken because the king had married someone else and he didn't even know. And he's one of Edward's closest advisors. Put him on the throne. He
was one of Edward's closest advisors, and that's part of the problem. I mean, the marriage is definitely a turning point, but at least in Dan Jones's book, it was very clear that basically Edward had been benching Warwick for a couple years. Like he'd given him all these huge titles after he'd taken the throne and rewarded him handsomely, but he kind of sensed that Warwick was perhaps just in it for the power. And so he started, just not heeding his advice quite so much, looking to other people for input and so forth. And then this marriage comes and just wrecks all of Warwick's plans for international diplomacy.
Basically.
So Edward's kind of in trouble after that, isn't
a little bit. And of course, because Warwick is so upset by this, he switches sides again and works to put Henry VI back on the throne of England, which he does successfully for a very brief period in 1470, up until his Henry's second deposition in 1471. So he reigns for another year. This is now, we're well and truly good and deep into the Wars of the Roses. Warwick doesn't survive much longer and is killed at the foggy Battle of Barnet, which is one of the big ones. One of those big battles in the Wars of the Roses that we'll talk about a bit, but he meets an unceremonious end. But he had made two men king, one for the first time and one for the second time. But he deserves his title as Kingmaker, and I think he's one of those important figures that just shows how being politically astute and smart about your alliances is what actually gets you places. It's not necessarily about having the biggest army or the best, as
yeah.
we'll see with the Battle of Bosworth, having the advantage, the home field advantage or the upper ground.
And least of all important is the claim to the throne. It's really just about who you can make happy.
Yeah,
to
if
get
Warwick
you there.
wanted Aiden to be king, I'm sure that he could have made
exactly.
Aiden
I
king.
could have been.
He could have made me king.
Yeah,
He could have made our cats king.
Possibly. Yeah.
Maybe not. I don't know.
Not Nico. She's too dumb. But anyways. And this is really, this is just to jump in here, this is my favorite bit in the whole story because it is so Game of Thronesy, because you have to remember what Warwick's kind of path was. He was starting out, we're going to use the Game of Thrones references. He started off working for the Lannisters as a minor noble. Then he switches sides to the Starks, and he gets Robb Stark all the way to the Iron Throne, claims it. And then when Robb Stark starts pissing him off, he goes back, finds Cersei, who he just deposed out of her throne, and, works with her to go back and try and claim it again, and is successful.
Yeah.
And then loses it again.
Yeah.
And that is just that is a crazy journey for one guy to go on this throne. And it just lays bare that, the only thing anybody cared about at this point in time was power.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with any sort of high-minded anything. It was literally just, I want to be able to do everything. Warwick is called the Kingmaker, but I think he probably had designs on the throne for himself. It's possible. To some respect, in some way, right? When he put Henry VI back on, at one point I think Dan Jones mentioned that, there was obviously going to be another power vacuum, but this time with most of the country still being loyal to the Yorkists. What was Warwick's game plan? Well, he was probably going to try and control Henry VI entirely and act as king, just like Somerset had and just like Duke of Anjou or Margaret of Anjou had. So it was really just, I love that whole story. And then he dies terribly, and it's great.
Yeah. So Edward IV reigns from 1471. The death of Henry VI comes at some point in there, and it's kind of unclear how he dies. It's said in the official accounts that he died of melancholia, but that is probably shorthand for he was killed by some guard in the Tower of London, because that's how kings were usually dispatched. They weren't beheaded; they were starved or something.
Or quietly disposed of somewhere. Yeah.
So Edward IV, and probably by Edward IV, obviously. Yeah. So Edward IV reigns from 1471 until his death in 1483. In his later years, he kind of got fat and lazy, and very likely died of a stroke brought about by poor health, poor eating, poor diet, exercise, all of that.
He was a major horn dog too. Apparently, this is the famous story of why he married Elizabeth Woodville. It was because she wouldn't sleep with him until he married her. Yeah. And he was that desperate that he said, So she must have been quite a looker. But this was his vice. Otherwise, people regarded his kingship as a very positive one. He was a good king, especially after the horror that was Henry VI's incompetence. He was the kind of monarch that the medieval realms were looking for, and they were used to. So he had his vices, and they led to his death, but he was remembered generally as a good king as far as kings go.
One of the interesting things about Edward that always struck me is that he was so keen to give people the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
Whenever
this comes up again and again. Yeah.
Whenever someone double crossed him, like when Warwick initially was,
he raised in rebellion.
Yeah.
Went to Calais, and basically Edward forgave him, I think.
Yeah. It was after the whole thing putting Henry back on the throne, trying to put Henry back on the throne.
That's right, yes.
That he was just like, we're good. Yeah. Of course, probably in his heart of hearts they weren't, but I mean, the fact that he was so open to forgiveness, even if it was just on the face of things, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, he did it a couple times.
He did it with his brother, his own brother
too. Yeah, also rebelled against him twice.
Yeah, and it was only on the second time that he was like, I can't afford to have this happen again, and had him executed
after a mock trial kind of thing. Yeah, so I mean, it is an interesting sense of how the inertia of the country worked, that there was a terrible ruler and they sought out basically this much better ruler who also had a claim to the throne. It wasn't as clean cut as Henry VI, but it was a claim. But what happens when Edward IV dies, Lindsay?
Edward IV dies, and his son Edward V, should have been Edward V, is only 12 years old, too young to reign on his own, and so is placed ostensibly under the care of his Uncle Richard. Yeah. Good old Uncle Richard.
Yeah.
So one thing I'm not clear on is whether or not Edward V was actually Edward V.
I don't I think he's titled as Edward V, because
But he was never anointed and coronated and
Yes.
never wore the crown.
I don't think so, but I think they still count him as the fifth.
Because Edward VI was Henry VIII's son, and so that had to have that would have to mean that there was an
there was
Edward
a
V.
fifth. That would make sense.
Even
yes.
if he wasn't officially sitting on the throne.
Yes. Yeah, we'll go with that. Yeah.
But Richard, his uncle Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, is put in charge of his care, or assumes the care.
It's an interesting one. The Dan Jones documentary about the Richard III period of this is a great watch on its own, because he kind of tries to take you through things from the viewpoint of Richard III, who wants to avoid a Henry VI situation with this new son.
Yeah.
So he starts off with the best of intentions, potentially.
And I think that's true, because Richard, in all of the infighting, and their brother, the Duke of Clarence, is the one that rebelled twice against Edward IV when he was still on the throne. Yeah. So while through that entire period of uncertainty with back and forth between Henry VI and Edward IV, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, stayed perfectly loyal to Edward IV the entire time and pledged allegiance to his son, Edward V, upon his death. So I don't think there was, at least initially, any intention for Richard to take the crown. Yeah. However, that's what ended up happening. It happened in a fairly quick period of a couple of months after the death of Edward IV, up until the early July of 1483, which is when Richard is crowned in Westminster Abbey as Richard III.
Yeah. Yeah, because he has his nephews declared illegitimate,
and then he has them. Initially, he puts them in the Tower for their own protection. It's just his nephew Edward, but eventually Edward's brother is brought there as well. Yeah. Because Elizabeth Woodville goes into hiding in Westminster Abbey. Yeah. Or is it Westminster Abbey?
Yeah, I think it's Westminster, yeah.
She goes into hiding in order to avoid the fate that she believes is going to happen, because she, she's very forward thinking, because it does happen. Exactly. So she keeps her sons close, but eventually both of the sons end up in the Tower of London, and they both disappear, and nobody to this day knows what happened to them. Although 200 years after the fact, a cask of bones was found buried at the bottom of a stairwell, which is where the common account was that these poor princes were buried. Yeah. So it's the princes in the tower, these poor lost princes in the tower, likely murdered on the authority of their uncle Richard III, which is the famous story that everybody knows from Shakespeare. Yeah. Probably happened. Richard was the only one to gain from their deaths. Yeah. So it's very, very likely that he had them murdered.
And there was a confession from one of his associates after Richard III had died and stuff, but it's probably
well, and as we'll see, everything that happens after this is clouded by the Tudor myth-making and the storytelling that the Tudors like to tell about themselves to legitimize their own claim to the throne. But either way, Richard III sits on the throne for a mere 2 years, 26 months, I think, before a long-lost Lancastrian relative named Henry Tudor comes from France to take the throne. And this is one of those fascinating things that happens. He's born of a mother.
Let's talk about the parentage of Henry Tudor.
That's what I was going to do before you interrupted me.
I'm just going to start it from the top. So the line starts basically with the wife of Henry V. After Henry V has died, she remarries a Welshman named Owen Tudor. And he's a noble. He's not, peasant born or anything like that, but he's a Welshman. Like, he has no real relation to anything. And she marries him and has two more sons, Jasper and Edmund. And Edmund in turn has a son named Henry. So literally Henry Tudor, who comes and claims the throne of England here, has a claim through his grandmother, whose only claim is that she was married to a king. She has she actually does have a minor blood connection as well, because she's also a great-granddaughter of
John of Gaunt.
Gaunt, going all the way back to that Edward III drama. So she has a minor bit of English royal blood, I guess.
She has French royal blood.
But
on his father's side, there's nothing. He was a page to the king. He was his grandfather, Owen Tudor, was nothing much at all. Yeah. As the English like to say, a bit of rough is how you might call Owen Tudor. Yes. So Henry Tudor's claim to the throne is very, very shaky. And to
almost
put it
non-existent.
To put it mildly. But he comes in and kind of sweeps into power with this triumphant meeting of the battle at Bosworth Field. It's this incredible 1485 legendary moment that sees Richard III charging across in a patch of open field from his very, he's got something like 12,000 men, and to Henry Tudor's like 3 or 5 or whatever.
Like not much.
He sees a direct line to Henry Tudor, charges through the field, but is unseated from his horse and is hacked to death on the field. And Henry Tudor is according to legend, crowned on this field after the crown is removed from a hawthorn bush or something, and it's placed on his head in a field, making Richard III the only king to die in battle, the last king to die in battle.
After Harold,
and the only king other than Harold to die in battle. So that's a pretty ignominious... Is that how you say it?
It's one of those words you never say out loud.
Yeah, you read it and you're like, oh yeah, I know what that means.
Yeah.
It was an ignoble end. An ignoble end to
that.
Richard III and to the Plantagenet dynasty.
Yeah.
Nothing will come of nothing.
So, and this is where, if you just read Shakespeare, that's the end of the Wars of the Roses. But actually, there's this back and forth continues for a while. And it's important to remember that Henry Tudor was backed by the French. This was a common foreign policy tool at the time, right? If there's insecurity in a country and you have one of the claimants of the throne in your country, maybe you'll send them over with a small army. And
Scotland did it too, didn't they? Scotland and France were always allied with one another, so I'm sure the Scots weren't too unhappy with Henry.
There might have even been some Scottish mercenaries in his army. I don't remember. So this continues happening even after Henry VII takes over. There's at one point another Edward. Someone claims to be the prince from the Tower who was somehow survived and wound up in Ireland. And what do you know? I'm going to invade with an army from the northwest. And so it's just interesting. This kind of pattern repeats itself over and over again, regardless of who's in power at the time. And it really doesn't end until Henry VIII kind of comes to power, and the next generation kind of solidifies the
very
Tudor
much
crown.
like Henry V kind of solidifying after the deposition of Richard II, right?
Yeah.
So that 50-year period is really an interesting thing. Just from if you look at a list of the battles that actually happened from the first Battle of St. Albans in 1455 to, I guess, the last one, the Battle of Stoke or the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Most of them, I think, out of all of them, only 4 were a definitive Lancastrian victory. The rest were Yorkist victories. Yeah. So to have a king that eventually comes back in Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, who, like Aidan mentioned, doesn't have a bloodline relative, a male bloodline relative that would connect him to the throne. He kind of takes it by force. Yeah. And so to see this much more powerful / lucky Yorkist dynasty kind of taken down by an upstart Welsh,
Lancastrian light.
Right. To come in from France with the backing of the French and take over must have been a bit of a shock, a bit of a blow. But it is interesting also to remember that the rivalry is much more than just Lancaster versus York, as Aidan said, and it's bringing that up with regard to Henry Tudor. There is another rival branch of the Lancaster family, the line descended from the mistress of John of Gaunt, Catherine Swynford, known as the Beauforts, who were disinherited but later put back into the line of succession. And so Henry VI...
so much.
I know, it's like, it's so crazy, but Henry VII is descended from that particular line. So he does have a claim. It's just so weak that it's not worth mentioning almost, right? And this is where some of that lasting, lingering doubt kind of solidifies, right? Yeah. Making that more complicated is the fact that Edward IV's descent through his mother is from Anne Mortimer, who was also a granddaughter of Edward III's second son, Lionel of Antwerp, to the first
Jesus.
Duke of Clarence. So technically, Edward IV maybe had a more direct line if you count his mother's line. We're gonna get into that a little bit, I think, at the end of our episode here when we talk about who should have actually been the rightful heir to sit on the throne. But it does get really messy, and that's why it's so much more than just Lancaster versus York. It's various houses of Lancaster and various dukes of York and their allies who all kind of step up and say, no, like, I'm the right person to be sitting on the throne.
And it is really interesting, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, is that by the end, there's hardly anybody left who has any traditionally royal Plantagenet blood, because they've all tried to take the throne or helped someone to take the throne, and then, or even just potentially have the ability to claim the throne, and they get killed off. The Wars of the Roses book that I read, The Hollow Crown, starts off with the final execution of a Plantagenet, who, she was an old woman. I think she was in her late 70s or something. 71,
like that,
yeah.
I think.
And she's murdered because she might, pose a threat to the crown
in like
somehow.
the 14 or 1540s
Yeah,
or something
yeah,
like that,
it was
right?
in Henry VIII's reign near the end of it. It's a very disturbing thought that they were this concerned about
Lancastrian uprising, right?
Yeah, even at this late stage.
The other thing that's kind of I don't know if I'd call it a misconception or if it's just something that is popularly assumed, but that the Wars of the Roses kind of took over the whole country.
Yeah.
And at first it really was just a dynastic squabble.
Mm-hmm.
But as these battles started to kind of roll out across the country, I mean, starting with the first Battle of St. Albans, which was literally fought in the streets of St. Albans.
Yeah, it was an urban war,
Very
which is very
much so.
uncommon, yeah.
You end up having, wherever these marauding Yorkist or Lancastrian armies were marching, the people in their path would end up impacted. And the people who were fighting in those armies eventually didn't even care about York or Lancaster. They're just like, you killed my father, prepare to die, right? Like, I mean, really, it really was just about vengeance. Yeah. And when you think about some of these battles, for example, the Battle of Towton in 1461 was the bloodiest battle and still is the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. I think the number is 28,000 soldiers or men died at that battle in one day, in a 2-hour period. Yeah. That was something like 1% of the entire population of England at the time.
Which is
That's
crazy.
insane.
Yeah.
The field was red with blood. It beats the Somme, the Battle of the Somme.
Yeah,
like
it's
in
literally
terms of,
the most bloody battle in England's whole history.
Yeah, like that's pretty crazy. All to decide who was going to sit on the throne. You have the Battle of Barnet, which, as we mentioned, that's where Warwick died. It was foggy and it was hard to see, and so men started fighting each other.
Yeah,
they were on the same side, and if
confused.
people approached from the side or from the front, they assumed they were on the opposite side, and so they were killing brothers, fathers killing sons. The Battle of Tewkesbury was where the first and last time that a Prince of Wales died in battle.
Yes, that's right.
That was Henry VI's son died in battle at Tewkesbury. So, I mean, these were incredibly bloody battles. They were harsh battles. They were involving the people, especially if the people were living in the town that the camps decided to fight nearby. So it wasn't like World War I or World War II in terms of the impact on the local population or on the people in the
English
military.
Civil War was far more dangerous for them. But
it was impactful. And I mean, a lot of these places, I think there's a field where the people, the losing side left the field so quickly they dropped their clothes and everything as they were running, and the field to this day is called Lose Coat Field because of that. I mean, this is something that it's deeply embedded and imprinted on the English landscape. So as the first Civil War, and it was England's first Civil War, it is very impactful. It's not surprising that Shakespeare would choose this period to write 8-9 plays about. Right,
basically, And just to jump on that, it is kind of the end of the feudal medieval period for England. It's after this that, especially with Henry VIII and the Reformation and Anglican Church coming in and everything, it's the start of that Renaissance, that Enlightenment era really begins after that. And this is the last kind of blood feud turned large scale for a crown.
Excepting the Civil War in the
Well,
1660s.
I mean, the
1640s.
Civil War was about a group of nobles trying to take over all rulership as for their own purposes as a caste or as a group, not necessarily for, I want to fight for, what's his name over there?
Yeah.
What was his name?
Charles?
No, the other guy.
Oliver Cromwell.
Oliver Cromwell. They didn't want to go fight for Oliver. They wanted just to generally have more rights and more ability to levy their own taxes. Whatever they were fighting for. I'm not an expert on the English Civil War, but this one was literally just like, well, no, I like the Duke of York more. He's a better king. We should go kill the other king right now. Yeah. Like that level of personal allegiance and not allegiance to an ideal was still, that is a definitively medieval kind of worldview and frame.
And Edward III was really at the height of that when Edward III back in the 1300s, all of his lords and dukes and everybody that he surrounded himself with, the earls, they all commanded large armies themselves. Yeah. And so it really was a feudalist system that was a militia that was comprised of all of these people. And eventually it becomes more about land ownership and it's about mercantilism and, mercantilism. Okay. And it's all of this stuff this other stuff that comes about that leads into Elizabeth's reign and the things that come out of that with, in terms of the trade and the Dutch East India Company and things that make money for the crown that nobody is really, not that nobody is concerned with it, but it's less of an issue, right? It's just we want good governance so that we can make money.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And this is actually one of the things that I know you're not a huge fan of Game of Thrones, and I'm not harping on this point.
Just say
but
it.
It is a very good representation, I feel, of the way that these Games of Thrones, games for the throne, were played amongst nobles who played with their the armies were made up of peasants and minor nobles who were willing to fight and die for their liege lord. But there's so many good quotes about within Game of Thrones. Littlefinger at one point points out that the peasants don't give a shit who's the king in King's Landing. Nobody gives a damn. Nobody cared who was king in London as long as the taxes weren't too high and they could eke out a living and have enough for their kids and so
not
forth.
die for their religious belief or their allegiance to whoever was lord over their
land.
Plot of land.
Exactly, yeah. And that was that whole way of life just started transitioning at this point. And that's one of the things I really wish Game of Thrones would get to eventually.
You can write to George R.R. Martin.
I'll just do it in my fan fiction. It's fine. I will get there eventually. They will have a mini industrial revolution in my continuation.
Why, some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrown upon them.
So speaking of fan fiction...
Shakespeare
basically is writing medieval fan fiction at this point. Fan fiction about the kings of England. Real person fic.
Yeah.
Not allowed on fanfiction.net.
No.
He wasn't working with the same sources that we have today.
No,
or obviously not the same sources, not the same caliber of source.
Well, yeah. Or not even the same... Yeah, like breadth of sources too is a really good.
This was at a period, you would have these hagiographies maybe that would be written about kings or whoever, but you didn't have comprehensive histories, and they certainly weren't unbiased as historians try to be today. The two main sources that Shakespeare was consulting were the Chronicles of England by Raphael Holinshead, written in the mid to late 1500s. And Edward Hall's The Union of the Two Noble and Illustrious Families of Lancaster and York.
I think that's a shortened title, actually.
It might be. It was one of those
there was another one I saw. It was
titles.
Like, the full page,
So, and on top of that, you have this new Tudor dynasty with Henry VII being a usurper, and then Henry VIII and Elizabeth I really trying to cement the legacy of their family. Henry VII famously combining these two symbols, the white and the red rose, that were not in use before Henry VII.
Not heavily, at least.
No, and put them together and made the English rose that is still used today on coats of arms and flags and whatnot throughout the kingdom. So you're trying to build a brand. You're trying to build a legacy. And going against that... by suggesting even mildly that the Tudors didn't belong on the throne, not buying into the myth that the Tudors were trying to sell, would have been very dangerous.
Yeah,
I want to bring up
impossible to publish and
especially for somebody like Shakespeare. Like I want to bring up a Richard III anecdote briefly. One of a poet, not anybody that I recognized anyway from the annals of literary history, wrote a very short couplet that made fun of 3 of Richard III's noblemen, Ratcliffe, Catesby, and Lovell, and Richard III himself. It was a couplet that made fun of them, called them barnyard animals, rat, cat, dog, and a hog, which was Richard III. Yeah. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered as a traitor. Yeah. Because for writing 2 lines of poetry. Shakespeare,
this was
in
during
his
Richard's
day, it
time,
was during Richard's day, but in Elizabeth's day, it would not have been wise or expedient in any way to write anything that would paint her ancestors, the winning team, in a bad light. Yeah. So he had to tread very carefully.
He did.
And so did the historians. Hollinshead and Hall and everybody else who was trying to write about this period in history was trying to do so in a way that painted the Tudors in the best light. And we see that in books that were started under Edward IV and were continued under Henry VII. And so it's interesting the way that these things kind of play out in the actual history.
And Shakespeare's plays are a great example, because the end result really of all these history plays is to show that Henry VII is the only logical solution to the troubles of England over the Wars of the Roses, and even before, all the way back to Richard II and Edward III. It's that, well, Henry VII is the natural outcome. And so everything kind of has to build to that. Most notably in Richard III has to be a perfect villain.
Horrible villain.
Because that just makes Henry VII by comparison look great. Yeah. So, I mean, he really does a number on Richard III's character.
Let's give him a hunchback. I mean, he wasn't the one to only do that, but and
he did have a hunch when they found his remains.
He didn't have a hunch. He had scoliosis, which would have made him appear to have one shoulder higher than the other, which is all that the historical record ever said about him.
It's true.
But they take that and they say, oh, it's a hunchback. Oh, he has a club foot. Oh, he was small and weak featured and looked like they just painted him in the worst possible light. And Aidan's exactly right, to make Henry Tudor out to be this great conquering hero. And
it also works for the other patriotic reasons, like Henry V being this grand orator. There's not really a lot of historical evidence for his oratorical skills. He was a great soldier and a great leader, but there's no we few, we happy few, we band of brothers in
Once
his
more
repertoire.
To the breach, dear
Yeah,
friend.
that's all.
He did have a
invention.
flair for writing, and his letters to some of his commanders, as your boy
Shakespeare.
No, you're right. The guy who wrote your book.
George R. R. Martin?
No! Dan Jones?
Yeah.
As he wrote, or in his documentary, he says he's poured over some of the letters that were written by Henry V.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And he did have a little bit of a flair for the written word.
Yeah. So
it's not entirely unlikely.
And actually, and that is worth mentioning, is that we're kind of bashing on Shakespeare as a propagandist, really, because he basically was for the Elizabethan court. But it's not like you can't get a decent idea of the thrust of that period from the plays. I mean, even if that was your only exposure to the Wars of the Roses, and then you listen to us just talk about it for half an hour, 45 minutes, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's close enough. That's kind of what I remember, right? So, I mean, the characters and the characterizations are obviously going to be way different, but the main story is actually fairly consistent across the plays.
And you have to remember also that Shakespeare was doing not just quote-unquote propaganda work for the Tudor monarchy, but he was writing allegories for what was going on at the time. Yeah. Right? And these were things that they were worried about the succession. They were worried about invading armies. At this time it was the Spanish and not the French, but and Shakespeare was also just concerned with good writing. I mean, it makes Richard III makes for a better villain when he looks like a villain, and when you kind of go through the is it called physiognomy? Yeah. Where what you look like represents what your soul is like. Yeah. It's just good storytelling. It's so much easier to have Charles VII fall in love with Joan of Arc, even though that never happened in real life. To have them fall in love on stage. We didn't even mention
Joan of Arc in the history.
Exactly.
Sorry, but
because that's French history.
Yeah,
who cares about the French?
Yeah, they only won the war. I mean,
but it makes for good drama when you see them fall in love, and when you see Joan of Arc rebuff the Dauphin, or when you have Prince Hal and Henry Hotspur, who is two of the most popular characters in the entire Shakespearean canon, they're a generation apart in real life. But in the play, in Henry VI, Henry IV, they are the same age. They are rivals.
They're kind of
that just makes for better drama. I mean, Shakespeare gets a little bit of poetic license. I think we all of us writers get a little bit of poetic license when we want to write about these things, because it just makes for a better story. And when you're putting on a play for 3,000 groundlings, well, they wouldn't all be groundlings, but when you're putting on for largely uneducated masses who aren't going to nitpick, this isn't the YouTube comment section of the Elizabethan time.
Well, I'm sure they did heckle if there's like, that's not how that battle went, and threw a tomato or something.
Richard III wasn't that bad. But, you have to make broad strokes. And so this is just, it's forgivable, I guess.
Definitely, yes.
But you have to understand that before you go into Shakespeare, you have to understand that this is not perfectly written. He made choices that impact, and unfortunately have impacted the way that we look at the Wars of the Roses and the way that we look at these history plays.
Yeah, because because they're so produced, they've been reproduced through time so often, and they're the one way that a lot of people will learn about the War of the Roses. They really have kind of created their own alternate history almost of what this time period was all about. And because of that, they've had a huge sway over the public imagination of this time period,
which is not something that is unusual today. I mean, I think as Lucy Worsley pointed out in her she has a popular series, history, well, popular for me anyway, because I like this shit, history, fact versus fiction kind of thing, where she takes down some of the fictions. She talks about the Battle of Stubben's Bridge during the Wars of the Roses, where the opposing sides, the Lancastrians and the Yorkists, threw Yorkshire puddings and blood puddings at one another on a bridge. That never happened. It was something that was invented in like the 1980s or something like that. So I mean, mythologizing and legendary stories are being told to this day, and it's not like we're immune to it today. So it's hard to look at Shakespeare and cast aspersions on what he did. It's just important to recognize that he did it.
Once more unto the breach, dear friends! Once more! Or close the wall up with our English dead!
So before we get into our well-patented bickering, Lindsay, I did want to just kind of touch a little bit on how Shakespeare interpreted it and how that's impacted our understanding of the time period, and how the histories kind of reshaped that for me as I was reading. At least it kind of reshaped how I consider the whole time period. And so for me, I mean, that whole time period from Richard II to Henry VII kind of taught me that the power of kings is temporary and heavily based on the will of the people. You know, it's basic poli-sci sociology.
Magna Carta!
Well, it's anything, right? Like the governed have to give their consent to the governors, right? And this just laid it bare in a time period where that was not how anybody considered any sort of power. It wasn't until Leviathan, which was after the Civil War in the late 1600s, that anybody even kind of came up with this idea of the body politic coming from the masses to give their consent to reign. Yet it's all here in the history, from King John all the way down to Charles I, who got his head cut off. The source of the true power has always been kind of like the noble class, especially in England. And those kings who kind of managed their nobles well, you know, they had fairly prosperous reigns. And those who didn't always face the reality that, I guess like William the Conqueror basically had a big family, and there were always a ton of branches on his family tree. And at any point, any of them could swing over and take back the crown, right? And that's what led to that, you know, the murder of that 71-year-old woman, you know,
Margaret Pole.
Yeah, Margaret Pole. It's such a telling instance, I guess, of the fact that everybody was kind of aware that that's where actual power came from. But however
uneasy they were with the idea of usurping the power, deposing an anointed king, and I mean, uneasy is the head that wears the crown, right? I mean, it's especially when that crown was stolen from a king who had the unwashable anointed oil of God on their head. I mean, you can't
just cut it off again. Like,
well, yeah, but I mean, it's just the anxieties were always there, even when that. And I can only, you know, when you talk about the masses and everything, Like it definitely was not. I don't think it was far from their minds that the power they had was not something, at least anymore. After Richard II, it seems like that was a turning point.
Yeah,
that anybody could be deposed and anybody could sit on the throne. You know, Henry VII did not have the greatest claim. He had hardly any claim.
Yeah. But he did it.
But he did it.
And then he reigned peacefully because that's what people wanted.
Yeah.
And again, I'm sorry, I can't help it, but this reminded me so much of Game of Thrones because the show and the books especially are so aware of the disparity between the medieval kind of understanding of where power comes from gods, or God in the real world case, and the actual reality of it comes at the end of a sword, based on who has the most of them, or, you know, dragons, I guess. And so it's really, really interesting to me as an example of that disparity in action. And I think in some ways, the Game of Thrones series and the books do a better job representing what the reality of that must have felt like to the people in that situation, where they have to pay. Maybe they do actually believe in divine right of kings and holy blood like they have in Game of Thrones. You know, the Red Woman can take blood and kill people with royal blood and so forth. You know, like. They might believe in that and might even hold some sway over their lives, but they always took the actions that they felt were right to do a very kind of humanist, materialistic understanding of the world. Henry VI is a shitty king. We need to replace him with a good king. And that was really what the Wars of the Roses kind of wound up being about. So I think when we get back to Shakespeare on that, you're kind of in this in-between space where Shakespeare kind of, you feel reading his history plays that he's aware of that, I guess, dichotomy or conflict between, you know, the pull for power and, you know, humans' basest needs to just rule over one another and also give their consent up to their monarch, versus the Tudor propaganda aspect. So it's kind of in this interesting kind of synthesis of these two different viewpoints in the Shakespearean text, which is really, really interesting. I think if you wanted more of the realistic how it actually was, you can go to George R.R. Martin and take his thing. If you want to see kind of the higher idealized version, you can go to Shakespeare. And they're both really good at expressing different ways of looking at that.
To be entirely fair, though, I mean, HBO does have a really big budget. So if they're doing anything really well, I think you just throw money at the problem. Right?
Yeah, okay, that's it.
No?
Yeah, no. You should really read the books. They're good, Lindsay.
Have it be cowards!
So now we get to the fun part of the episode.
The fun part.
The bickering.
Yes.
We kind of questioned what kind of bickering we could have on an episode like this, because we're dealing with historical topics and the history maybe is kind of settled on this. Can you debate history? I don't know.
Well, we're about to find out,
We're
aren't
going to
we?
find out, because the question we've decided to tackle is, who should have been king? Henry VI or Edward IV? Oh. And I'm going with Edward IV. Honestly,
All right,
I think
give it to
Edward
me.
IV.
Explain to me why you're wrong.
That's quite haughty of you. Well, aside from being haughty is a good word to use, because Edward IV was a haughty McHotterson. As far as I can tell, he was quite a good-looking king, and I'm gonna go for the good-looking guy over anybody else any day of the week.
Wow. Okay.
But I think the fact that he had this. When you go back to Edward III and you look at his sons, yes, his elder two sons died, but the lines didn't die with them. Yes, it died with Richard II for sure, but his second son Lionel, Duke of Clarence, had this other line through his daughter, Philippa, but his, I guess, what was it, son, great-granddaughter Anne Mortimer? Great-granddaughter?
If you're going back to great-granddaughters, Linz, it's not a strong claim, I gotta say.
No, it's still a claim. Descent from the second-born son is better than descent from the third-born son, or anything beyond that. And Edward IV does have that in his back pocket, that he is descended from the second-born son of Edward the Third. And so that places his claim higher than anybody else's. And I'm sorry, the numbers don't lie. 2 is better than 3 when you're talking about second ordinal numbers. First is the best, and second and so
6 is the worst, is what you're saying?
Well, if you're the sixth son, yes.
Okay.
But if you're the second son, your descendants, and the first son is dead and all of his descendants are dead, the second son should reign. But this is where you get into, male-only primogeniture versus male preference primogeniture, and how we have females involved now. I mean, it's only recently. It was 2013, I believe, when they changed it in the House of Windsor now. Not only it'll be interesting. We'll get to this. Hold on. My train of thought is kind of going all over the place. But there was the potential for the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge to have a daughter who would assume the throne after her father, William, dies or abdicates, right?
If it was Georgina instead of George.
Yes, it would have been fine. Georgina, yeah. And as it is, Charlotte has not been displaced by Louis. Yeah. So she is still retaining her place in the throne. Poor Prince Harry is all the way down.
Oh, poor him.
But... Yeah. Anyway, and also what's interesting is we have now this modern notion of every time a woman was Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth, upon their death, the house changed because the husband would give the name or in Elizabeth's case, the new house would. Elizabeth changed, her father actually changed that and said that all of their descendants will be Windsors. So it'll be interesting to find out if Charles will keep the Windsor name or if he'll go back to
changing it afterwards,
Battenberg or whatever it is that his father, if you go back through Prince Philip's line.
Greek, whatever.
I doubt it, but I mean, so these are very modern notions, but I do think that as a modern, strong woman, I'm going to say that Lionel Duke of Clarence's daughter Philippa of Clarence and her descendants are the reason that Edward IV has a much stronger claim to the English throne than any of his cousins.
Okay.
Also, he's hot.
Okay. I mean, sure. I'll grant you all that and just say
Thank you. We can end the podcast right here.
I really don't have much more to... I mean, that's a very reasoned, considered argument about multiple lines of descent. Which is all bullshit, of course, because once again, that's not why anybody should be king. A king should be made because they have the will of the people underneath them to rule, which Henry VI, by all means, did not have in the least.
So how can you argue that he should be sitting on the throne?
Because there should be no king, is basically what I'm saying. So having a bunch of nobles come together and decide, like, hey, you know what, you go handle the war in France, and we'll look after tax policy, and we'll cover, any public works that need to be done, and you guys can go train. That's how a much more reasonable government was done. So that first 20 years of Henry VI's reign, perfection in my mind. He was, and there was a strong woman in the background there. You should really like that, Lindsay.
I do. I really do like that. Margaret Anjou was my girl.
She was hitting it for her country. So her newfound country. She was French. She was helping the English monarchy survive this terrible monarch.
It's a real kumbaya moment right there.
Exactly. And honestly, I would have been fine if that would have kept up. Of course, it couldn't because there was no power. There was no institution in place to replace a terrible king. There was no House of. I mean, there was the House of Lords. There was a parliament, but it was, not a real thing, and it was only called when the king wanted it. No, you can't answer your question yet, Lindsay.
God damn it.
So yeah, my answer is Henry VI because he was the worst king. Therefore, he should have been king for as long as possible. Now you may ask.
I just want to clarify. So you're saying a House of Parliament / House of Lords, or both in combination with one another, would be better than ruling by divine right?
Yeah.
I have one word for you.
Theresa May.
That's 2 words. My one word was Brexit, but you kind of ruined my moment there, you asshole. But yes, do we want to turn this into a Brexit podcast?
Yeah. What do you think the chances are? Elizabeth just comes in and says, "No, you're not leaving."
I don't think she's allowed to. I think they talked about it. I think she wants to. I don't think she's allowed to. I think it's constitutionally barred for the Queen to get involved.
They don't have a constitution. They have a bunch of patchworks from Magna Carta to now, and that's part of the problem. And one of them, I'm pretty sure, says the Queen can decide whatever the fuck she wants.
Well, you know what? If they're going to bring up some obscure 16th or 15th or 17th century doctrine that says that a bill can't be put before Parliament twice in the same sitting without substantial changes, Opine is being made.
Exactly.
I have no
Erskine
problem.
May,
John Burko is
all the
going to
way.
go and find some 13th century thing that'll allow Elizabeth to step in and revoke Article 50.
I mean, can you imagine the lawyers that would have to try and parse through 700 years of common law?
We're entering season 3 of Brexit. I mean, by the time season 20 comes on, no one's going to be watching. It's going to be like General Hospital, right? But I'm willing to let it ride out because
You're there for the drama. I mean, it's great.
Okay, so when Brexit happens or whatever, and this episode of this podcast is suddenly very outdated, we're going to listen to this and cringe that we allowed this to
it might even
happen.
happen before we air this one, actually.
It
So
may.
we
Who
might
knows?
end up cutting all this. But for now, I enjoy the Brexit commentary.
Parting such sweet sorrow that I shall say good night till it be morrow.
So I guess that ends our discussion of the Wars of the Roses. Obviously, we've been talking for an hour and a bit, but nothing deep has occurred.
No.
I think we each read books combined. We spent about 20 hours researching this. There's
nothing.
The people who Trevor Royal and Dan Jones, and we mentioned Lucy Worsley, and there are a lot of other historians of much greater caliber who have spent their lives researching this stuff. There is so much more you could go into, so much more depth you could get into, going all the way back to Edward III and continuing it on through the House of Stuart and into the House of Orange. But
we wanted to provide our context for our future episodes about these plays. And that's what we are going to return to is now with this backing of the history in mind. As we read through the plays and talk about them, we'll probably return to some of the points in here about the history and how this character was changed into this way and this is not accurate and so on and so forth. So we just wanted to provide that context for through this episode. And
it is going to come up because we briefly mentioned the tetralogies. Shakespeare wrote 2 tetralogies in kind of 2 quick bursts of creative momentum, I guess. And 1590 to 1592 was when he wrote this first one, which is the Henry First and Second and Third Part Henry VI and Richard III, which, if you want to think about it as the Star Trek, these are the later. Sorry, if you want to think about this as Star Wars, these are episodes 4, 5, and 6.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
But in 4 parts.
Yeah.
And later in his career, he wrote the first tetralogy, the major one, which was the first and second part, Henry IV, Henry V,
and Richard
II, which predates that. So that's kind of the prequels in Star Wars. So he wrote these. They're actually
better than Henry VI for the most part. But anyways,
they are. They're much more interesting. And he was older when he wrote them. I mean, a lot of people suspect that a very young Shakespeare had written Henry VI, so he was maybe still a teenager when he was writing these plays.
Or he had help or something, and it's not entirely in his voice.
So those 2 tetralogies plus Henry VIII, if you want to look at that, or there are other plays that he had a hand in writing, but those 8 plays are the ones that primarily concern the Wars of the Roses. So as we talk about those episodes, as we talk about those plays, you can refer back to this episode or seek out some of your own research. The 2 books that we read, we would highly recommend that. We'll throw them up, links to buy those on our website, as well as some of the YouTube documentaries that we watched that we found particularly interesting, including one that may challenge the idea that the Windsors should be sitting on the throne of England at all, which all has its seeds back in the Wars of the Roses. It's such a juicy part of the English history.
Indeed. So thank you for joining us. We hope you'll listen in next episode as we tackle the first of the tetralogy plays, Henry VI Part 1, which is not the first play, but we'll get into that next week.
Not next week.
Next episode.
You can find all our episodes on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast fix.
If you want to tell us what you think of Shakespeare, his plays, poems, or any of the topics we discuss, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact us on Twitter, that's @TheBixPod,
on Facebook at facebook.com/TheBixPod, or by email at thebixpod@gmail.com. That's our cue to exit.